Welcome. Welcome to MPAI 600 Week 4 here at Georgetown University School of Applied Intelligence. School of Continuing Studies Applied Intelligence Program. Announcements, just the next Zoom session is 24 November. It's groups for groups 1, 2, and 3. As I mentioned, about 20 minutes per presentation and about 5 minutes for questions. And for groups 4 and 5, the paper is due then, so be cognizant of that day. That's a key point, and that's a Sunday before Thanksgiving. So the second question, again, start thinking about your papers. This is, again, as you go through this module, this week's module, as well as future modules, the papers are very relevant to it. So please, as you're going through it, start thinking about what you're going to say on papers, and the earlier you think about your papers, the better. So paper 1 overview, I think everyone did pretty well. Just a couple of issues. The requirements were far too broad. Narrow them down in the collection requirements. This is not a very good collection requirement. Terrorist attack threat in Nashville, New York, whatever city you choose. That's far too broad for someone to actually collect on. This is a lot more specific, a lot more effective collection requirement. So again, the key is just to narrow it down as much as possible. Policy versus intel requirements. There's a fine line, so it's sometimes difficult to discern the two. But let's say you're the head of cybersecurity for your firm that you're working at, and if you ask, does Windows 2010 defend against potential ransomware attacks? That kind of puts the cart before the horse, and there's danger in doing that because you've almost tipped your hand to say that the Windows system that you have, that you've invested in and you've probably put money in, is effective. You're going to kind of skew your answer to answer that question. The better would be, what are the composition and disposition of ransomware requirements that might focus against my IT system? That might be a better question to go with than then starting out with a policy question coming forward. And then the next, again, open source intelligence. A lot of you brought this up, which is good. We didn't bring it up in class, and maybe we should for the next time. But just keep in mind, social media does not work in all cases. North Korea nuclear missile intelligence would not go well under social media intelligence. MS-13 would not be very well for social media intelligence. MS-13 tends to recruit through normal person-to-person contact in familiar roles. ISIS recruitment might be a better social media target. Russia influence, even sometimes Russia influence in Ukraine. Open source intelligence has been used to identify Russian personnel who might be in the Donbass region, or Russia influence in the Baltic states. Social media intelligence or open source intelligence might be effective. So again, it works in some cases, doesn't work in others. Just keep that in mind going forward. So week 3 review. Again, we have the Pearl Harbor case study, and you have the 3 kind of schools of intelligence failure brought up in the DAL. The traditional school is whether it's a Pearl Harbor or other intelligence failures, there was just too much information. The analysts were overwhelmed with data, and they couldn't separate the wheat from the chaff. I don't necessarily believe that this was responsible for the Pearl Harbor intelligence failure, but the Wallstetter article discusses it in depth, and it's certainly a potential that's out there. There's a reformist school, which this argues that the intel community isn't structured to receive data, analyze data, and then push it forward so actions can be taken on this. This is brought up in the Pearl Harbor case study. I think it's accurate that information was collected at the federal level, at the Army G2 and Naval G2 or N2 levels in Washington, D.C. through Magic and Purple and other collection assets, and this was not disseminated down to the leaders at Pearl Harbor. This argument is put forward by the families of Admiral Kimmel and General Short specifically, And this argues, again, that the intelligence community is not reformed well, and you have to move the boxes and who reports to who and other authorities so that you have a smoother collection and dissemination of information. You're going to see this in the 9/11 case study that we're going to talk about this coming week, where information on the 9/11 plot was collected at the National Security Agency, but it was not disseminated down to state and local officials or the FBI due to bureaucratic reasons and other structural issues. And then you have the contrarian school, which argues that information is not collected well. This is at the collection level. And there's not enough collection assets to bring in information. Arguably, in the Pearl Harbor case study, there wasn't enough collection on the carriers, the 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, which everyone knew at the time would be a linchpin if war was going to start. But because of collection deficits, we did not have the capability, understanding of the disposition of those 6 carriers. So those are the 3 case studies. Dahl argues, I think accurately, that one of the other intel failures is the interface between policymakers and intelligence community, whether it's policy or military leaders and the intelligence community. He argues that the information has to be specific enough so that military leaders can take action on it. If it's not specific, if it's very general, then military leaders or policy leaders will ignore it. I somewhat agree with this, but not really. And the reason I being is I do agree that the interface between policy and intel is a key point in looking at intel failure, and that might have contributed to the Pearl Harbor failure. But I'd also argue that you never get specific information. You're never going to know that on December 7th at 8 o'clock, these carriers will strike Pearl Harbor, this installation, from the north at this time. That information doesn't exist. You're not going to know on 9/11 that these 19 hijackers are going to hijack these 4 planes and target these facilities and arrive at these airports. That's not reasonable. For those of you who are doing, who are veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, there was never intel, and those dealt with the IED problem. There was never intel saying this IED would occur at this time in this grid coordinate, in this. And target this convoy. That was very, very rare. Which brings me to the Sharma School. It's not really the Sharma School, it's just something I kind of made up, but the actual underlying issues are there. And this argues that, and I argue, that intel should be specific enough that it can reduce risk, or reasonable countermeasures can be implemented to reduce risk. In the Pearl Harbor case study, I argue that there was enough information, they knew the threat, they even had a good idea of the strategic understanding, that reasonable risk reduction measures, canceling Sunday leaves, increasing long-range reconnaissance patrols, could have been implemented to mitigate the threat. In the 9/11 case study, there could have been, again, you didn't have the specific intel, but you did have an understanding that there was a threat to civil aviation, and that the aviation could have been used, or an airplane could have been used as a Tomahawk missile, as it was used in the 9/11 case. And to buttress that, there could have been reasonable risk reduction measures, increasing federal air marshals, hardening the cockpit, putting the drink cart in front of the cockpit, which is what you do now, which is actually very simple to do. That were a reasonable risk reduction measures that would have prevented a 9/11 case study. You go back to that IED planting. Again, you're not going to know the time, date, location of an IED being planted, but you might know through your analysis that this convoy at this time has a little bit more risk than follow-on convoys, and that convoy can implement countermeasures, drive slowly, maybe dismount for part of their patrol, that are reasonable risk reduction measures that could have been implemented. So that's kind of the Sharma School going forward. You can agree with it, disagree with it. It's not really a Sharma School. It's just risk management framework that companies and the military has been using for forever, and intelligence to drive these risk reduction measures. And it should be geared towards driving these risk reduction measures. So the Yom Kippur War, again, you had just key parts. You had the over-reliance on a human source. You had the addiction to preconceived notions that Egypt wouldn't launch an attack unless they could neutralize the Israeli Air Force. Syria wouldn't launch an attack unless Egypt was launching an attack as well. And then you had the lack of an intelligence assessment. Israel was good at analyzing the order of battle for Egyptian aircraft and Egyptian land units. What they didn't do very well is assess surface-to-air missile versus Israeli airplane, or anti-tank missile versus Israeli tank. That kind of asymmetric assessment was lacking, and that led to disasters in the first few days of the Yom Kippur War for Israel. So week preview, a lot of work this week. Just keep that in mind. 2 case studies, Iraq WMD and 9/11. The Iraq WMD case study, again, focus on the Iraq WMD case study, do the readings and lectures, and then go to the 9/11 case study. So Iraq WMD, the documentary, the Rachel Maddow, is partisan, but I think is an accurate interpretation of what happened in the run-up to the Iraq War. 60 Minutes Curveball is also another analysis, I think good analysis of the run-up, the intelligence failure that run-up to the Iraq War. And then the committee report, the Senate Select Committee report. It's 200 pages. Do not read all 200 pages. Just focus on the blue boxes, which kind of give the high points of the intelligence failure. And if you have more curiosity, you can go in a little bit more depth going forward. And then you have my lectures on politicization and IC failures. For 9/11, again, you have the documentaries, National Geographic and the Nova NSA documentary. Very good documentaries. Please watch them. And then you have the readings, the Dahl and the 9/11 Commission, and then you have my lectures. So a lot this week, but I think it will prepare you for the paper that you have due the following week. So if there's any questions or issues, please let me know, and I look forward to this week's discussion.